So we're going to talk a little bit about strategy and how that impacts your portfolio planning and governance process. We'll go through, a portfolio governance process at a high level. There's really no right or wrong answer to how you govern your portfolio. A lot of that is based on, the industry you're in, if you've got any regulatory type concerns, as well as the maturity of your organization and even some cultural drivers. We'll talk about portfolio prioritization, scoring, and then how you kind of put it all together at the end. So the problem at hand, you're a portfolio leader and you've got an intake process and you've got a variety of work coming in, requests, ideas, things that people want to get done, and they're all trying to drive different goals and objectives. So how do you get your head around that work and come up with a way to filter through all of that and ensure that your organization is focusing on the right things to drive your corporate strategy, increase sales, increase your time to market, and some of those key drivers that make businesses tick. The other challenge that many of you may have is, you're going to be scarce on resources. Even if you've got a lot of budget authorization, maybe you don't have the right skills in your organization. Maybe you need to look at staff augmentation. Maybe you've got people tied up in running your business versus driving change in your business. And so how do you incorporate those levers into your portfolio planning process to get more resources focused on changing the business versus running the business? And oftentimes there is a lack of prioritization overall, and the goals and objectives of the organization are unclear. Maybe your strategy is still in the storming part of its development versus the performing part of its development, and it's hard to get folks focused on where they should be putting their efforts and energies. So that's part of the challenge that you have as a portfolio manager, is taking all of that noise and chaos and putting some sense and order around it. So a little bit about strategic planning. The big goal of strategic planning is to provide organizational purpose. It's to come up with a vision and mission for your company or your organization that enables you to be effective and efficient, enables you to drive additional products and services for whatever your end consumer is, as well as increase wealth for your shareholders. There is a whole strategic planning process, and we won't get too deep into that, but it definitely drives how you want to get after prioritizing your portfolio. And you need those strategic inputs in order to enable an effective scoring model for your portfolio. So a little bit about, again, a high level around how developing strategy for your organization basically matures. So it starts with identifying, which is in the upper left-hand corner. So it deals with setting your mission or vision. This is typically done at the highest levels of an organization. And then the agenda setting typically then flows down through the C-level management. Oftentimes organizations will then do both external and internal assessments. So you're looking at what things are driving the market. Are there economic factors that you have to take into consideration? Are there key competitors that you have to take into consideration? Are there other products and services coming into the marketplace, as well as technology advances? There's also the internal assessment. This is often also driven through C-level department head type folks, where they're looking at what capabilities do I have within a specific department that tie back to that agenda, and how can we drive the strategy from that. As portfolio manager, you're taking the information at the top half of the slide, so as it results to identifying and diagnosing, and you're using those inputs as part of how you will then help the organization conceive the portfolio and then realize it. So the conception part of the portfolio is generating options. And think of options as basically generating the scenarios that you're going to use to help your organization determine what work they want to do in a given period of time, whether it's a fiscal year, a quarter. Some organizations do 18, 24-month planning. Some organizations go out as far as 3 and 5 years. So you're coming up with options for your organization as far as what work can be done, and then you're going to select a scenario or select a group of projects and programs and run the business type work. And then your action taking, or the realizing side of the quadrants, is where your project and program management comes into play. So this is where your folks are actually executing on the work that you generated on the conception side, and then your performance and control is your actual project and portfolio governance. So it's basically how, as a portfolio manager at a high level, you can kind of see where you play in the quadrants, but also where you get inputs and provide outputs back to the organization. So a little bit about strategic tensions. And this happens across all organizations and can be influenced by a variety of different people in the organizations, and it's kind of a dynamic or a continuum that has a little bit of maturity based behind it. But if you think about your strategic processes, the content that flows into your strategy, and then the context, which are typically your external factors that flow into your strategy, as well as your internal capabilities. These are all things that will help drive how an organization's strategy is formulated, but also play into how your portfolio evolves. So if you think about some of those strategic tensions and you think about key leaders in your organization or key drivers that may tweak levers around those tensions, think about your markets. So what markets is your organization playing in? Consider the resources that you need to apply to be successful in those markets. Are you in an industry or vertical where you've got a lot of compliance and regulatory concerns? Where are you from an organizational capability perspective? Are you in a new company, or a company that maybe is recently changed direction, and so what you're trying to do along with driving strategy and driving business results, you're also trying to mature resources in different skill sets. And then, of course, there's always the purpose of an organization, and typically there's that's tied to profitability, being a good corporate citizen, and, of course, driving shareholder value. And these tensions, play throughout the life cycle of a portfolio, and they will often change as an organization changes or as different factors play into an organization. If you think about how your company may have been behaving back in 2005 or 2006, and then you look at maybe some things that happened in 2008 and 2009 as we had tensions in the economy, and now as things are starting to level out, how your company is behaving now, and what changes did you go through? Did you go through cost reductions? Did you go through right-sizing organizations and how right-sizing reorganizations, and how did those types of activities play into what you selected or didn't do from a portfolio perspective? So if you think about where organizations play in strategy, you've got your arenas. So these are things like product categories, market segments, geography, core technologies. Where will your organization be active and participate? You think about vehicles. How are you going to get there? Will you grow your strategy or grow your organization by joint ventures and alliances? Will you be a company that builds their portfolio of product or services based on acquisitions or mergers, or will you be a pioneering organization that does a lot of their growth via internal development? What are your differentiators going to be? How will you win in the marketplace? What's going to drive customer loyalty? What's going to drive having a customer choose you? Is it image? Is it price? Is it styling? You think about Apple as an example. Styling is a big part of their corporate image. Is it product reliability? I used to work for Maytag way back in the day, and we had the dependable repairman. And so product reliability was a big cornerstone of that organization's ability to differentiate themselves in the market. Staging. This deals with, it's kind of, think of staging as the big chessboard of how you pull your strategy together. How quickly will you go into certain markets? How quickly might you expand? How will you sequence your initiatives? So this is where you have to, as you're looking at the initiatives that come in, are there dependencies that need to be taken into account? And, does Project A or Program A need to get kicked off before you can start Program B? And then there's always the economic logic. And so how are you going to obtain your return on your investment? What are those thresholds? And then as you're looking at projects that could impact products or services, how will the pricing of those things impact the longer-term returns and gains for your organization? So if you think about your portfolio planning process, the major focus of this discussion is on portfolio selection, optimization, and a little bit about how you're going to report that back to leadership. There's the demand management piece, which is basically all the information that goes into feeding your portfolio, and then the planning and managing side is really the execution side of it. And we've had discussions earlier in the year, and we'll have some additional discussions in future webinars on some of those topics as well. A little bit about portfolio relationships. So as you're thinking about your portfolio, both from a scoring perspective as well as decking up the work, you'll want to have data elements in there to help both with scoring as well as managing it that pulls your projects into various programs. Those programs may be business aligned, they may be product aligned, they could be driving certain compliance measures or metrics. And then you also have to account for the other work, because in most organizations, as you're looking at resource and capacity, whether it's human resources or financial capacity, that other work plays into one of those strategic tensions that could dilute your ability to execute your portfolio. Oftentimes you'll have resources that may not necessarily be focused just on project-related work. They've got run-the-business type work that they do simultaneously. And so how do you account for and manage some of that other work as you're thinking about both scoring your portfolio and then executing your portfolio longer term? And then how portfolio and strategic alignment kind of all tie together. You've got your strategy at the front end, which typically drives a set of goals or objectives. Out of those goals or objectives, you have capabilities that you're trying to mature your organization into being able to deliver, whether it's a product, a service, a technology, a competency. And then those projects and programs are the actions that you take that basically feed back to deliver your strategy. So as far as aligning your portfolio from a strategic perspective, to the degree that you can have some strategic drivers in your portfolio scoring models, it definitely helps take some of the noise out of it, and you can get into those, shall we do this work or shall we not do this work, a little more easily. So putting some numbers and some tangible examples into it. So you've got your strategy, and again, some goals. Maybe you're going to grow your organization to a certain sales or revenue amount. Maybe you want to improve customer satisfaction. You want to increase the investment level you're doing for new products or services. Some of the capabilities that you're trying to possibly drive. You want to grow your organization by acquisitions. Well, not only does that mean you have to have the capital to do it, but you have to have the skills in your organization to go out and be able to acquire other companies, as well as merge those companies into your organization from a technology, culture, people, and process perspective. Maybe you want to build industry-leading competencies. So you want to be considered the industry leader in something. And then again, some of the projects. So you're going to buy an organization. You're going to incorporate a new company into yours. You're going to establish a way to grow customer loyalty, or you're going to be able to fund certain collaborative adventures. And so again, these are hopefully some high-level examples of how you can tie projects back to capabilities, to goals and objectives, which then drive a strategy. ultimately what you want to get to is you want your strategic planning process to really be the key driver into your portfolio, and to the degree that you can cozy up to those executives and get a seat at the table, whether it's yourself as a portfolio manager, or if you report up through a C-level person, to get them to include you in those discussions. It definitely enables you to help, one, gain visibility as to some of the behaviors of the executives at that C-level area, and try to get a sense as to where their hot buttons are and what it is that they're trying to achieve. But as a portfolio leader, you can also help drive organizational championing and sort of the top-down, bottom-up understanding of the portfolio, and really help people focus on the fact that, yes, we want to drive strategic and capabilities, but we also have to look at how we're going to get the work done, how we're going to staff it and source it, as well as how do you tie back into your technology organization to ensure that there is a technology fit and it's fitting into what your technology organization is trying to accomplish from a longer-term technology roadmap. And this is where, as a portfolio manager, you can provide a lot of value to the organization if you can be the person that kind of ties these three circles together. So a little bit about a framework for scoring your portfolio and prioritizing it, some things to keep in mind, and some contextual components to build into your scoring model. You'll want to have some strategic drivers. You'll want to develop some financial measures to help basically weed out those projects or programs that drive solid financial returns versus ones that maybe don't. Tying back to a financial person in your organization, if you don't have a financial analyst that's in your portfolio team, this person can help you, basically come up with, what are some of the drivers that the CFO is looking for. Leverage that financial person to help you come up with those financial metrics. And remember that if you're just starting out in a portfolio scoring process, and oftentimes if you're starting out in the scoring process, you're also maturing your business case development capabilities at the same time, you're going to have to probably do a couple cycles in this in order to get proficient in those areas. So, starting out with really lofty, high-level, returns on investment or net present value measures or things of that nature, you may want to start at levels that your organization can grow into, as well as you can help, again, drive those business case development skills, because oftentimes you're going to have leaders that have lofty goals and aspirations, but when you put the reality check against it, it may not necessarily pan out. You may want to include in your portfolio scoring processes a process component. Are there certain things that your organization is trying to drive efficiencies in? If you're in a manufacturing type organization, you may have certain lean or Six Sigma related measures or metrics that you want to include in your scoring model. There may be a technology architectural component that needs to be included. Are there certain technologies that your organization is starting to lean away from, or are there certain technologies that your organization is starting to adopt? And for the most part, most of the projects that you're going to be pulling into your portfolio will have a technology component in them somewhere. And so how do you get scoring attributes around architectural fit? And then, of course, there's risk. And for risk, you have to take a look at all of the various dimensions of risk, whether it's cultural risk as far as how your organization has the capability to execute. Are there product or service-related risks? Are there economic risks? Or are there other risk factors that you want to take in from a scoring perspective? So a little bit about the overall process and how you kind of start to put all the pieces together. When you initially set up your portfolio, and go through the first selection process, that will probably be iterative. And to the degree that you can come up with a way to force rank things, 1 through 100 or A through Z or whatever linear view that you can take, that's always helpful. if you end up with clusters of everything being 1 or clusters of everything being 2, it becomes very difficult when you get into those decisions where maybe you're running out of funding, or maybe you need to insert something else into the portfolio mid-cycle. How do you do that if you've got a cluster of projects or programs that are sitting at a certain level in your portfolio and you can't determine where to make that insert? The process of analyzing your portfolio, that's also somewhat iterative. It's not necessarily one and done. You'll want to be looking, just as you monitor the health of a project, you'll take the execution portion of how your projects are doing and you'll feed that back into your portfolio. And you should incorporate times in your governance process where you really want to revisit the overall health of certain projects and programs and how are they driving business value. Has your business value changed? And do you need to make some of those tough decisions around potentially killing certain projects, deferring certain initiatives, or delaying certain initiatives? And then ultimately, on the backside, the overall goal of this is to deliver business value and outcomes for your organization and for your shareholders. And so the green section of this is really the execution side, and that's where you've got a great team of project and program managers that can drive this out for your organization, and an organization that is rallied around the cause. So getting into the nuts and bolts of portfolio scoring. So what is it? You want to establish some standard criterion measures that can be consistently applied across the various work that flows into your intake process. So whether it's projects, programs, maybe there are minor enhancements that you also count as part of your portfolio. And what you want to be able to do is pick the ones that are going to yield the greatest benefit to your organization with the least amount of risk, and ideally the lowest amount of cost. The other thing that a portfolio process provides for you is, think of it as providing a common currency or a common language for you to go after the ability to assess different projects and work and determine which investments should be made. Similar to, if you think about as you're looking at project management talent, whether you're a big advocate of PMI or not, the one thing that PMI does do, while it may not necessarily provide you an assessment of how effective a project manager may be in actually delivering work, what it does provide your organization is the ability for a common framework as well as a common language. Think of portfolio scoring somewhat in the same context. As you're thinking about developing a scoring model, you should consider both pulling in both tangible and intangible attributes to it, particularly if you're starting out. And keep those attributes as things that the organization can get their head wrapped around, and keep them at a manageable number. What you don't want to do is have people have to fill out long forms and so forth, and go through long discussions around where a certain attribute sits. To the degree that you can keep your scoring model somewhat simple initially, and then mature it as your organization becomes more proficient, that will yield you the best results. You want to be able to accommodate some multiple attributes, whether it's around cost, size, risk, again, strategic alignment, organizational capability. And you want to be able to align beyond your financial measures. Your financial measures are important, but there are times where you will possibly be making decisions around doing a project that may not have the greatest return initially, but it's the right thing to do for your organization. The other area where things around non-financial measures come into play is if you're having to make certain technology advancements or investments where possibly you've got maybe technology that's become outdated. And so what you're having to do is re-platform a certain set of processes from one tool to another tool, or from one technology platform to another platform. Oftentimes this doesn't yield you necessarily great returns, but it's one of those I got to do it to keep my organization running type of initiatives. And so to the degree that you can get your leadership team to kind of determine, is there going to be a certain threshold, whether it's an amount of hours, an amount of money, that you can sort of bucket some of those types of projects against, that will also aid in your scoring model. As you look to build your scoring model, you want to establish some common criteria. You want to make sure that they're very well defined, and so as you're putting together your criteria, make sure that you've got a set of definitions that everybody can get their head wrapped around and it's well documented. You want to establish values that you can basically tie back to some numeric calculation. So if you're going to use low, medium, and high, put some numbers behind it where maybe low is 1, medium is 3, high is 5, etc. And then as a portfolio leader, come up with some mock examples that you can basically get your organization's head wrapped around. So prototype your scoring model with some projects that have some level of contextual meaning to your organization so that they can understand how it's going to work. This will also enable you to kind of define and put some criteria in place, or at least have a sense as to when you might have people that are trying to cherry rig or dummy the system, because you'll always have those that are going to try to beat your system. And then again, work back with those financial friends of yours to determine how you're going to quantify your benefits. It could be programs, it could be enhancements. And to a certain degree, you may even have some run-the-business type work that you need to pull in just to be able to, longer term show what the resource capacity is. You're going to then want to gather that data as to how you're going to evaluate it. That could be business case data. It could be, number of measures or metrics that you want people to populate based on some form of an assessment. And the evaluation portion of that data, that also could become iterative. If you think about as you're estimating a project, and this is where your estimation processes will play into it. At the early stages when it's just an idea, the amount of squishiness around that idea could be plus or minus 50%. As you get that idea more refined, as you get more business needs and features defined, or as you start getting into some high-level requirements, the amount of squishiness around that estimate should start to pull in and become plus or minus 30 or plus or minus 20. You'll then want to define and apply hurdles. And these are the various thresholds that you come up with for your various measures. So maybe you want your projects to have a certain level of economic return on investment, and maybe you want those projects to have that return on investment come in a certain period of time. You may want to have a certain percentage of your portfolio driving certain key competencies or capabilities. And so you apply those hurdles so that you can, again, sort of weed out what we do now versus what we defer versus what we possibly don't do at all. You then go through the process of value and ranking your projects. So again, it's coming up with that A to Z list of what we're going to do in rank order. And then you'll apply a cut line, and often the cut line definitely ties to how much money you have to spend on your strategic portfolio and or how many resource hours you may have. And there's, of course, correlation to that. But typically that line is something that can be pretty solidly defined. And then that gets discussed. And it gets discussed more often than not on a regular basis. To the degree that you can pull together a prioritization team, and typically that has senior representation across your organization that helps drive those discussions and participates in those discussions, that will give you optimal results from your portfolio. And the scoring process is done in an iterative fashion. Of course, you'll definitely engage in it as you go through your annual planning and budget process, but you'll want to reevaluate your portfolio on a regular basis, whether it's quarterly, some organizations do it monthly, just to see what's happened and what's shifted. As you have that cut line, if you've got projects in flight that all of a sudden come back with change requests and so forth, where they may require more resources or less resources, that could have that cut line go up or down that list, and you'll want to look at reprioritizing and possibly reshuffling the deck depending on some of those inputs and outputs. So a sample scoring model. These are just some high-level components that you can think about incorporating into a scoring model. So you've got things like cost and duration, scope and quality, your architectural and risk profile. And these are typically driven by project deliverables, as well as what capabilities you're trying to get out of an organization. And then you've got the value proposition side of the fence. And this is where a lot of your business case data would be driven out of. So you've got your return on investment, your benefit and cost ratio. Are you trying to solve for a new business problem, a competitive problem, or a capability improvement? From there, your scoring may come up with some weights and measures. And as you go to put your scoring model together, my recommendation would be, rather than presenting your executives with a blank slate, come up with a couple of different prototypes for them, and go to the extent where you're actually going to weight and measure them out, and then let them debate if they agree with those weights and measures or if they want to tweak or make some changes. The other thing that you may need to take into account is if you've got different types of projects, they may opt that for certain projects they want weights and measures to differ based on those project types. That will make your scoring model a little bit more complicated, but it's important that you get that insight from them so that everybody buys in. And then digging back through your weights and measures a little bit further, this is where you put some of the thresholds on them. So let's just focus on the benefit side initially. Benefits was part of the strategic or business case component. And so if you think about the things that could drive benefits, what's going to drive revenue increases, and that's weighted at 25% of your benefit score. And then within that benefit score, you've got various thresholds where a project could sit. A revenue increase that's going to drive an increase of $270,000 in revenue, the scoring of that benefit component would be a score of 3. Cost savings could be something similar. Maybe I'm going to generate a cost savings of over $1 million. So that cost savings is weighted at 25% of the total benefit score, and in this particular example, it would get 5 points. So again, you've got a context of weighting the overall driver and then the various thresholds within that weight. Again, typically your benefits aligns to or supports strategic objectives in some way, shape, or form. If it doesn't support your strategic objectives, it aligns to some form of investment objective, whether it's driving revenue, improving cost savings, driving cost reduction, or cost avoidance. Cost avoidance is always a sticky subject with organizations because it's sometimes very hard to quantify, and it's even sometimes harder to measure. So if you're looking to incorporate that into your scoring model or into how you develop business cases to feed into your scoring model, just remember that there's a certain degree of subjectivity that you may need to apply to the cost avoidance component. If you think about driving benefits, are you going to be looking to drive reductions in your operational risk or improve operational efficiency or support compliance? And then to what degree does the project or program that you're doing enable or support future investments in a capability? So here's a high-level spreadsheet view. And again, whether you're going to be driving a portfolio scoring model off of spreadsheets, which you definitely can do, or whether you've got a tool to do it, either way works. They just take different levels of the human capital investment to maintain them and keep the data flowing through. But at a high level, in this particular model, it basically does the math as to whether or not it supports certain goals or objectives or fulfills them, or there's no contribution to them. And then from there, you can drive a certain amount of scoring from it, and then rank your projects and apply your cut line to the projects. The other component to think about as you look at portfolio scoring, and this also falls into how you're going to do your overall project and program governance, is you'll want to come up with some form of a gating strategy. And from a gating strategy perspective, it both applies to your intake process before a piece of work becomes a project or program or a minor enhancement, as well as how you monitor and control that as it goes through the project life cycle. To the degree that your gating strategy can tie back and provide data back into your scoring process, that's a good thing. It's particularly important as you've got projects that may require some level of change, whether it's an increase or decrease in resources, be that human resources or financial resources. Additionally, want to incorporate some level of the ability to monitor what's going on the run the business side, particularly if you don't have resources and funding segmented between your project portfolio and what you need to do to manage and run your business. The other thing that gating strategies help with is making those kill decisions. And there are times where you're going to have to stop a project, defer a project, or completely kill a project. And how do you get your organization rallied around that, and then as well as help them understand that it's not necessarily lack of performance from a project team's perspective, but it's that things have changed in your organization. Maybe economics are driving it. Maybe there's a new product that you need to release. Maybe there's a new competitive threat that you need to get after, and you may have to kill or defer projects. And so how do you leverage that gating strategy to feed into how you both score and select and maintain your portfolio long term? So some secrets of success. What you want to be thinking about as you're looking at a scoring model is develop an initial model with a handful of scoring criteria. Don't get super robust or go nuts, because the one thing you have to remember is as you're introducing this, you're going to be relying on people to providing that cut of data for you. And if you make it too long and too arduous, one, you may not get the quality, and it's going to also be hard for you to get the adoption rate. You're going to want to employ some very solid, repeatable financial analysis practices, and that's where give your the folks that are going to be pulling together this information a decent set of tools, whether it's a spreadsheet, a business case, however you're going to pull that information together, so that you get the information in a common fashion, as well as you can assess the information in a common fashion. And this goes back to making sure that people understand the definitions of the various criteria and measures that you're going to use, so that they know how to give you the best data possible. To the degree that you can establish a prioritization committee, that's always a great thing. Have it be cross-functional, and have it be senior leaders who are empowered to make decisions. In previous organizations that I've worked in, both in manufacturing and financial services, that's been most effective, where you've been able to get a good cross-section of leaders. You get those folks that are committed to doing this, that are committed to putting the time against it, and they meet on a regular basis, and they have candid conversations. Consensus always isn't a great thing, so if you've got the VP of marketing necessarily disagreeing with the VP of manufacturing, that's not a bad thing. But at the end, you do have to have that group to drive a certain level of decision making so that you can continue to execute against your portfolio. And then again, implement a gating process to monitor that in-flight work. Whether you pull in projects based on how they go through your project management life cycle, or you pull in projects based on duration. You can set that gating process to work in a way that will work for your organization, but you definitely want to wait to be able to assess your in-flight work so that you can determine how those data elements feed back to your portfolio prioritization process and if things need to be reprioritized. Some common pitfalls that organizations can come across when you're looking at project scoring. Scoring becomes the sole means for ranking and prioritization. Let's face it, there's always going to be the option where a project or a program comes into the organization that may not have the greatest return, but it's one of those things that the organization has to do. And even though it doesn't come up as from a ranking perspective as the number one project, it becomes the number one project in the organization. That happens more often than not, so you need a way to accommodate it. You may acknowledge that Project A is going to be the top project for the organization from a scoring perspective. Maybe it doesn't pan out that way, but you need to be able to accommodate that. You don't want to have frequent rescoring of your portfolio, and by rescoring it's not necessarily reassessing where a certain project falls from a scoring perspective, but it's changing the criteria. So what you don't want to necessarily do is be changing your criteria on a regular basis where it causes projects to shift. If for some reason a project all of a sudden increases scope, which of course is going to drive increased costs, a certain score could go down because maybe the business case has been diluted. There's nothing wrong with that, but what you don't necessarily want to do are change the criteria or the thresholds on a regular basis. You don't want to have poorly defined criteria, so again, it's really important to have that vocabulary out there and that taxonomy so that people understand what they're being measured. You don't want to have overly complex calculations or weightings, because then when people don't understand it, they're just going to kind of get frustrated with it, and you're going to end up not getting great data from it. And then you have to monitor those folks that might be trying to game your system. It will happen. Just kind of keep an eye on it. So some criteria, and again, this was incorporated into the model, but sort of the short list. You've got your financial measures, which could which could include return on investment, cost avoidance, cost containment. You may have vendor management strategies, sourcing strategies, technology-driven efficiencies, platform standardizations, which could drive decrease in costs. Could have value creation measures. Maybe you're driving business efficiency and process optimization. You could have a certain level of execution focus measures. You could be trying to address a certain number of compliance concerns. You might have a criteria around probabilities of success and what types of different components would you pull into that. And then, of course, things around benefits. And you could have criteria around resource availability. Without your resources, it's going to be hard to do execution.